On to tonight's talk. This is the Mitchell Memorial Lecture, where we invite a distinguished speaker to talk. And this year, I can think of no more distinguished or suitable speaker than tonight's, who is Professor Sir Harry Burns from the University of Strathclyde. Sir Harry Burns is Professor of Global Public Health, and he was the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland from September 2005 to April 2014. He's been known for his work to address health inequalities, particularly the importance of the early years as the basis for health and well-being in adulthood. He was knighted in 2011, and in December 2014, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, invited him to join the Scottish Government Council of Economic Advisers to look at the issue of inequality. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome Sir Harry and his lecture, What Causes Wellness?
Well, can I say thanks very much for the opportunity to come here. It's a particular privilege to speak in memory of Tony Mitchell. My clinical practice was as a surgeon, so I never really encountered him in a professional sense, but was very well aware of the work that he was doing here. During the time he was here, during that whole of that, I was working as a surgeon, so it's a privilege to speak in his memory, and it's been delightful to meet his daughter and grandson tonight, and I hope I do his memory justice. I gave up surgery after about 15 years. My physician colleagues say I was too smart to be a surgeon, but I'll leave you to judge that. So where's the... So what I'm going to talk about is this question, what causes wellness? Because one of the reasons I gave up being a surgeon was I was operating in the Royal Infirmary. I was a consultant in the Royal Infirmary for 5 years, dealing with the most economically deprived people in Britain. We are constantly told in East End of the hospital, and they were very sick. And it was very clear to me that the conventional explanations for the depth of their illness just didn't stack up. And therefore, one of my colleagues went off and became a member of Parliament. That wasn't for me. But I went off and did public health and started to try and understand just how social conditions and economic conditions caused you to die prematurely from molecular events. So I'm going to describe to you this kind of intellectual journey I've been on, linking social conditions and what goes on inside your arteries and your DNA, because it's only by understanding the science that relates social conditions to these outcomes will we ever come up with the right explanation. And that's led me to consider the fact that actually, as a profession, we spend too much time worrying about illness, and we need to start thinking about wellness. So, we have this question. In Scotland, we believe that we are desperately unhealthy because the Daily Mail keeps telling us that. And it's because we smoke too much, we eat the wrong kind of food, far too much fat. I've never actually seen a deep-fried Mars bar, I don't know what it's going on. We drink too much, apparently, and if only we would man up, if I'm allowed to use that expression, if only we would man up and do the right thing, everything would be okay. Well, the reality is only one of those statements is true. And part of our problem is we take big conceptual things and just take them for granted, take them as gospel. We don't question them. So the first part of this talk is going to be about questioning some of those statements. Smoking. Scotland is one of the lowest smoking rates of any country in Europe. And I say that in Scotland, folks say, surely we keep being told we're big smokers. This is a World Health Organization study looking at smoking rates in 15-year-old teenagers across the European region of the World Health Organization. Scottish 15-year-olds were the fifth lowest smokers in Europe in this study. Smoking prevalence in men in a study carried out a few years ago. Scottish men, third lowest smokers, beaten only by the Finns and Swedes. Scottish women let the men down a bit, they're closer to the European average, but they're still not above the European average. Smoking can't account for this. Yes, it's socially patterned, it's common on the lower down the social scale you go, but it's not accounting for what we believe to be happening in health in Scotland. About fatty foods. The classic case of the country that has done something about fatty foods is Finland. The North Karelia project. The yellow line there is Finnish heart disease mortality from the 50s up to the end of the century. You see that Finnish heart disease mortality was high in the 60s, so they transformed the diet. They took subsidies away from dairy farmers to discourage them from using butter and cheese and fat and so on. And they gave them the subsidies back if they switched to growing fruit and vegetables. They made free fruit and free salads compulsory in all schools and workplaces. And then they said, aren't we clever? Look what's happened. They created a medical tourism industry to Finland as folk went to see what it was they'd done. But fundamental research error, they confused association for causation. Because every other country saw heart disease mortality fall at the same time. The pale green line alongside Finland is the Scottish heart disease mortality. The Finns took radical action to change their diets. Scotland did absolutely damn all to change its diet. And we saw the same outcome. The reducing incidence of male smoking and the introduction of statins probably account for this decline across all countries. We take things for granted, we don't question enough. So, we oversimplify the problem because we haven't analysed it enough. We apply inappropriate thinking, therefore, and as a result, nothing changes. And if you look at the trend in life expectancy in Scotland, you see another couple of things. This is life expectancy in 16 Western European countries, going back to 1851. 160 years worth of data here. You see the impact of the Second World War, the First World War, various bits of Austro-Hungarian, Franco-Prussian unpleasantness in the 19th century here. And you see that for most of that period, Scottish life expectancy has been at about the middle of the European average. It's only in the last few decades that the rest of Western Europe has pulled away from us. So there's nothing genetic about Scotland's poor health. It's a recent phenomenon. And if you look at the rate of growth in life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population since 1950, it looks like that. And the rate of growth in life expectancy in the poorest 20% of the population looks like that. If the gap between rich and poor that existed in the 1950s had been maintained at the level of the wealthiest, Scottish life expectancy would be at the middle of the European pack. What has happened to slow the growth in life expectancy in Scotland has been something happening at the lower end of the socio-economic scale. So what has it been? And when we come to try and analyse this and think about it, as medics we are bedeviled by the whole idea of pathogenesis. Everything we think about is couched in terms of disease. Even prevention of disease is still part of that pathogenesis paradigm. WHO definition of health, complete state of physical, mental and social well-being, not only the absence of disease or infirmity. Everything we do is about pursuing the absence of disease or infirmity. Trying to cure it, trying to treat it, even trying to prevent it. And when we create a specialty like health improvement, we try to improve health by shouting loudly at people to tell them to stop doing bad things that will cause them to get sick. Health improvement is about changing illness. It's not about creating the conditions for wellness, which I would argue is a completely different thing. It's not about achieving a good state of physical, mental and social well-being. You can understand why they think like that. You know, medicine has, during the 20th century, produced astonishing advances. The silver bullets, the stories of Banting and Best and insulin in Toronto, where a ward full of children with type 1 diabetes just waiting to die, and they wandered around with the first preparations of insulin, and the children woke up. The ward was apparently filled with the shouts of their parents and so on. Astonishingly moving impact of medicine. Tuberculosis and streptomycin, life-saving again for young people. Polio, almost eradicated. So, you know, it's understandable that medicine should celebrate the successes. And it's, you know, medicine as a treatment produces a hell of a lot of income for a lot of people. So there are economic drivers in all of this. We need to stand back and think more broadly because the world is changing. People are getting older, costs of all of this are going up. We need to think differently. So we decided to try and analyse inequality. If inequality and widening inequality is what's dragging down the average of life expectancy in Scotland, what are the basic causes? And everyone said, well, it must be heart disease and cancer, mustn't it? That's what's driving the inequality. So we decided to look closely at it. And one of the things we did was calculate the slope index of inequality for the population. The way you do that is you take 5-year age bands, you look at mortality per 100,000 population in each of the deprivation categories. We use the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation to do this. So there are 5 quintiles. Mortality in the most affluent quintile here, mortality in the most deprived quintile here. You subtract the best from the worst and divide by the mean, and you come up with a single figure that represents the slope of inequality. So a 45-degree angle of inequality is roughly equivalent to 1. And you can then plot that across the life course. That's what inequality looks like for men. Women are very similar. Inequality in mortality in Scotland, and probably for every other country, although I can't find any evidence of any other country doing this, is not a feature of the elderly. Inequality shoots up by age 15. And it continues at a hugely high level until about 45 or 50, and then it begins to come down. And if you begin to tease out what are the causes of this, you can take, say, ischemic heart disease, plot the inequality figures for it at different age bands, and come up with a slope index of inequality for ischemic heart disease. Subtract it from the all-cause mortality, and you get a figure like that. Heart disease doesn't cause health inequalities. Yes, there will be a social distribution, but it's not driving that pattern. So what's the basis of that? What occupies that bit of the graph? Suicide, drugs, alcohol, and violence. Accidents, assault, disorders due to use of drugs, chronic liver disease, disorders due to the use of alcohol. We're not going to fix that by reducing the saturated fat content of the diet. These are sociological and psychological drivers that produce huge increases in teenagers, and it's maintained during young working age life. So what's going on? What's the basis of this? And if you look at the time course of the emergence of some of these things, because remember this is the last few decades we're talking about, what I've done here is I've distilled out just for alcoholic liver disease, mortality in our 16 Western European countries. The line at the top is the highest level of mortality that any of those countries reached. This line at the bottom is the lowest level any of them reached. Most of that peak there is France, actually, but it could be a different country every year. The mean of our 16 Western European countries is the thick line in the middle. And from 1950 to 1970, That was Scottish liver disease mortality. The idea of Scots as a nation of happy drunks is a myth. Scots were very abstemious. And in the 50s and 60s, if you think about the drinking culture, who drank? Men drank. When did they drink? At the end of a working week. Where did they drink? In the pub. What did they drink? They drank beer. Very circumscribed culture. So from 1970 to 1990, mortality went up a bit, but it was still below the Western European average. And then, in the past 2.5 decades, guess what happened? So who drinks now? Everyone. Where do they drink? Everywhere. What do they drink? Everything. And when do they drink it? All the time. It's completely changed our attitude to alcohol in this country. We've been pushing to get minimum pricing for alcohol to prevent very cheap alcohol being sold in quantities. And earnings-related price has gone up over the past few years, and therefore Scots men have come up to the top. Scots women still have the highest mortality of any country in our Western European sample. But you see, it's been an emergent thing. So what happened in the latter decades of the 20th century to produce this? Because most of this is concentrated in West Central Scotland. Dundee City has some of it as well. It's mainly the counties round about the River Clyde. And in order to, this moved us on into this idea of, well, if this is what's happening, our capacity to be well has obviously been eroded, so we need to ask ourselves this question. At the same time as this, we realised that what was happening in this West Central Scotland area over the last 20, 30 years was a collapse of employment. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, hundreds of thousands of men were employed in shipyards, in heavy industry and so on. All those jobs, which were meaningful jobs. A welder or a riveter in the shipyards, he was a man of some stature. Almost literally, he had to be to do that work. Those jobs disappeared and they were never replaced by anything useful. And at the same time, houses were being changed. Old Victorian tenement houses were being knocked down and high-rise flats were being built. And tightly knit communities began to disintegrate. So we think that emerging out of that social chaos has been an absence of wellness, an absence of the things that allow us to create wellness for ourselves. So what are they? The antithesis of pathogenesis is salutogenesis. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being. She was also the Roman goddess of safety. Interesting, both sides of the same coin there. Safety, a sense of safety contributing to well-being. And colleagues in the Nordic Institute of Public Health use the term salutogenesis as literally as an umbrella to encompass about 20-25 different theories that have emerged as to how we create a sense of well-being in ourselves. Now, I have to put my hand up and say I haven't read all of these. Okay? The book on ecological system theory has been by my bedside for quite some time, and I suspect it will probably stay there. But if we just pick a couple, the American psychologist Corey Keyes studied children progressing into adulthood and how they succeeded, and he coined the term flourishing. Flourishing individuals, he said, are happy within themselves. They see themselves as having a purpose in life. They feel themselves as having some mastery over their life, some control, a sense of the future, that they need to be growing because they have a stake in the future, and that they have a sense that they are captains of their own fate. They're not victims of external forces. And that's typical of many of those theories. They all talk about optimism. One of the studies we did where we looked at Isaac's personality inventory, we found that people in the most deprived parts of Glasgow who scored highly on extraversion were as healthy as people living in the most affluent parts of West Central Scotland. extroversion seen with someone to protect them. Now, the professor of psychology said, actually, no psychologist can quite tell you what Isaac's personality inventory measures, but it measures extroversion, but it's obviously a good thing. But we're assuming that it was something to do with this business, this ability to interact with others. Another guy who has been very important and was very influential in my journey here was an American sociologist called Aaron Antonovsky, who studied the health of adults who, as children, had been in concentration camps. He found that 70% of them, he spent a lot of time in Israel interviewing them, 70% of them were seriously damaged by their experience. 30% of them had survived and were doing very well. They were flourishing in the sense that Corey Peace would describe. And Antonovsky said that the hallmark of the flourishing children was that before they went into the concentration camps, he argued, they had acquired this property that he called sense of coherence. And a sense of coherence consisted of basically of three things. The ability to see the world as making sense. The ability to see it structured and predictable and explainable. You made sense of what was happening. Secondly, you had the sense that you had the resilience, the internal resources required to meet the challenges that the world threw at you. And thirdly, that you saw those demands as challenges that you wanted to engage with. And he said that children who failed to develop a sense of coherence saw all the events round about them as noise, not as information. And as a result, they would be chronically stressed. Now, I remember reading that passage. I sat bolt upright because I was a surgeon, and a surgeon's job is to create acute stress in people. It's what we do. The acute stress response is our body's response to threat and injury. And what Antonovsky was saying, that the way in which children develop in early life, if it didn't develop appropriately, you would switch on the stress response permanently. And that was the first link I saw between the psychosocial drivers of inequality and the physical causes of poor outcome. Because I wanted to tease out that physical link without knowing the biological consequences of the sociological circumstances. We would always be just wallowing about looking for an answer and not finding it. So we started to look for data that showed that people were chronically stressed. This is Canadian data looking at salivary cortisol levels in babies in orphanages. The longer a child is in an orphanage, the higher his salivary cortisol becomes. Something chronically stressing to a child in not having an interaction, a consistent interaction with a single significant adult. This is Michael Marmot's data from the civil service, from the Whitehall study. Data in cortisol profiles in lower grade civil servants and higher grade civil servants. You see, the lower down the hierarchy you go, the higher the stress levels. And when people, when I say that, people say, but aren't bosses always the most stressed? Michael showed 30,000 civil servants followed up for what, best part of 30 years now. But very clearly that the least stressed person in any government department is the permanent secretary. And I love telling them that. Why? Because if a minister asks a permanent secretary to do something that they don't fancy doing, what do? They get the next guy down the line to do it. And if he doesn't fancy it, it goes all the way down the hierarchy till eventually all the rubbish no one else wants to do usually lands on the desk of the chief medical officer who's permanently stressed by the experience. Control. Antonovsky's notion of being able to control the event round about you and engage productively. One of Michael Marmot's colleagues, Martin Bobak, 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, went around the country to the former Soviet bloc and asked thousands of people a control questionnaire. How much control do you feel you have of your life? Russians have the lowest level of control mortality rate, all the way down to holds and checks, high levels of control, lowest mortality. In West Central Scotland, the areas with the highest mortality, broadly comparable to the Baltic states. And if you're living with the bedroom tax, you're living with Department of Work and Pension sanctions that take away your money for 3 weeks for turning up late for your appointment, if you're living with social workers threatening to take your children away from you and so on, you don't have control of your life. Other people have control of your life. And that is associated with higher mortalities. So how does this happen? What's the biological process that leads to this upregulation of the stress response? The best way I've got describing this is to explain to you a study I saw in the psychology department of a New York university, where the experiment they did was they made baby monkeys depressed. Okay? That's not a happy baby monkey. And the way in which they made the baby monkeys depressed was all related to the way mum was allowed to feed the baby. In one half of the animal house, mum's playing with the baby, swinging around the branches and all that kind of thing. And the food is just over there, and when the baby says he's hungry, she goes over and she gets it, and she's back, and they're playing again. The other half of the animal house, they take the food away. The mum has to go and forage for it, she has to go and find it, she's away from the baby for much longer. She's stressed because she has to fight with other mums for access to it. And if I were to ask you which group of babies do you think are most likely to be depressed, is it the one where mum is with them all the time, or one where mum is away all the time? You would probably say it's the group of babies where mum is away all the time. Yeah? And it's this point where I can usually spot the working mums in the room because they start to think, oh gosh, well, don't worry ladies, because it doesn't make any difference. The stress hormone levels in babies where mum was there all the time are the green triangles, where mum had to go away and forage for food are the yellow triangles, and it's the same. The babies who became stressed and depressed are the red triangles, and in those cases, what they did was they randomly changed the feeding pattern from one day to the next. It wasn't mum being there or mum being away a lot. It was not knowing. It was inconsistency. And if you think about it, Antonovsky said that a sense of coherence depended on seeing one as structured and predictable and explainable. So what's the first stressor a baby feels when it's born? Hunger, usually. So what happens? Baby cries. And what then happens? Mum picks him up, cuddles him, talks to him, feeds him. And by the time that process has happened 500, 1,000 times, the neuronal development is laying down tracks that show this is a consistent response. The one that's consistent. If I feel a bit funny here, I just do the crying thing. This nice person comes along and fixes it. I'm in control. The one that's structured and predictable, and I'm in control. Contrast that to the experience of a baby who, when he feels hungry, sometimes gets fed, but sometimes doesn't because mum's drunk or under the influence of heroin. And even worse, mum's boyfriend picks baby up and shakes him, hurts him, because he doesn't want him to have a crying baby, never having been nurtured appropriately himself. Baby learns the world is not structured and predictable, and it's actually bloody dangerous. So what he does is he upregulates his stress response. The survival response kicks in. And cortisol was part of that. My colleague in New York, Bruce McEwen, who works at Rockefeller, has done amazing work on developmental neurobiology and epigenetics of the brain and stress and neglected influence. A whole load of animal models where they expose newly born pups and so on to predator scent and so on. And consistently what he has shown is 3 areas of the brain develop differently when babies are exposed to stress. Prefrontal cortex and hippocampus both fail to develop such dense cell connections. The significance of that is the prefrontal cortex is the bit of the brain, particularly the ventromedial nucleus of the prefrontal cortex, the bit of the brain that allows you to see the world as structured and predictable. The bit of the brain where you take in new information, process it, and respond appropriately to it. So children who experience chaos and neglect are unable to suppress inappropriate behaviour in new social circumstances. The hippocampus, the second bit of the brain that doesn't develop so much, is the bit of the brain that allows you to learn. You integrate short and long-term memory in the hippocampus. So children who experience neglect have poorer attainment at school. But the other critical element of the hippocampus is it's the bit of the brain that has the highest concentration of cortisol receptors in normal circumstances. Michael Meany, another colleague who works in McGill in Montreal, has shown in young adults, Canada keeps a brain bank, and young adults who have died as a result of suicide or accidental death or whatever, he looked at the concentration of cortisol receptors in the hippocampus in those young adults. And where there was a history of neglect or abuse, the cortisol receptors were virtually not there. So the mechanism by which the elevated stress responses occurs in these children is all down to a failure of development of the system that ultimately suppresses cortisol production by the adrenals. The other bit of the brain that changes is the amygdala. Lights up when you're emotionally aroused. These young animals become fearful, anxious, aggressive. They become as if, they're on a short fuse. And again, when I talk to teachers and you talk to them about school pupils who are fearful and aggressive and anxious, don't know how to behave inappropriately, can't learn, say, you see that all the time. So what we're beginning to see is this very powerful biological set of processes kicked off by neglect in very early life. We decided that this was a good story that Bruce was producing, so we thought we would take it out and examine it in people in West Central Scotland. MRI scan in which we measured volume of the hippocampus. Volume is significantly reduced. White matter density in prefrontal cortex is significantly reduced the lower down the social scale you go. Functional MRI shows amygdala changes and so on. What we see in the animal models is what happens in real life. And it's not just stress hormones that are affected by this. There are all sorts of mechanisms by which inflammatory mediators become activated as well. This is a study of 5,000 West of Scotland men followed up for about 10 years who were interested in heart disease. We measured C-reactive protein as a measure of inflammatory status. The more down the social scale you go, you see a doubling of CRP in normal, otherwise healthy men. Where they smoke, they double CRP as well, and if you've got a body mass index greater than 30, you double CRP again. So fat, poor smokers have CRPs that are 8 times higher than skinny, non-smoker, rich people. And what we discovered in following these people up is that men in the lowest CRP quintile, followed up for 5 years, were men in the highest CRP quintile were 10 times more likely to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes compared to men in the lowest CRP quintile. So here we're seeing a set of processes kicked off in early life that's helping to predispose to type 2 diabetes, and it also predisposes to heart attack and stroke. Cholesterol narrows arteries, gets deposited in the lining of the artery, but you don't get the clot until the endothelium becomes disrupts the endothelium, the inflammatory response. That's why statins have been so successful. Yes, they lower cholesterol, but they also block the inflammatory response and prevent the acute episode happening. So what's happening in very early life leads to all these changes, but it does far more. It changes the way young people's brains develop that lead to failure in other respects: drugs, alcohol, suicide, violence. And the mechanism by which the cortisol receptors disappear is known also. It's the molecular biology of a hug. Okay? It's what happens when you hug a baby. It's probably what happens when you hug me. But that might depend on who's doing the hugging. 5-hydroxytryptamine, serotonin, released as a neurotransmitter in the brain when babies feel contented, circulates in the bloodstream, picked up by transport mechanism in the cell wall. Chromosome number 5 has a locus on it that, when it is epigenetically altered by 5-hydroxytryptamine, produces the cortisol receptor. Failure to hug a baby, failure to nurture a baby, prevents them building a key part of the molecular mechanism that's responsible for suppressing the stress response. So we've got this chain of events that says, actually, what happens maybe even prenatally, but certainly post, well, we know it happens prenatally as well, because what the epigenetic change happens that way. That whole set of processes leads to a set of changes that sets individuals on a course for failure. And it's not just Scots. Every major cohort study that's looked at the relationship between neglect and abuse in childhood and subsequent outcomes found the same thing. The Adverse Childhood Events study in California, middle-class California, 17,000 members of the Kaiser Permanente health system. These aren't poor Latinos, these are middle-class people. They looked at 9 different types of abuse or neglect, 3 or 4 types of parental absence and so on, and they related that to outcome in adulthood. If, as a child, you experience 4 or more of those adverse events in early life, you're 8 times more likely to be diagnosed as an alcoholic compared to if you have none. Boys who experience physical violence at the hands of an adult, 8 times more likely to perpetrate domestic violence when they grow up, 4 times more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. The ACE study shows similar huge increased relative risk of narcotics addictions and so on associated with this. Drugs, alcohol, suicide, violence. What we believe has happened is the disintegration of society through loss of economic status, loss of self-esteem, loss of communal support and so on in West Central Scotland in the 60s and 70s has produced intergenerational change that has upregulated these behaviours in younger people in their 20s and 30s now. This is the pattern of morbidity in the ACE study on drugs, alcohol, suicide and violence. I'm cheating here a bit because that's relative, that's adjusted odds ratio and that's standardized mortality ratio, but you see the pattern is very similar. So what causes well-being then? What can we put together here as a hypothesis that we can begin to act on? Well, Antonovsky says we feel well when we feel confident that whatever the world throws at us, we can manage. The sense that we feel a bit of stress, we know how to resolve that tension, and that gives us the sense of well-being, and that comes from feeling that whatever the world throws at us, we manage it. We can deal with it. And actually, we want to deal with it. We want to get out of bed tomorrow and face tomorrow's challenges. But Antonovsky recognised that we are all liable to be stressed beyond our previous experience, whether it be bereavement or loss of employment or whatever. He said, then you have to dip into the external society resources. Resources that come from having a loving family, a sense of nurture, having success in work, being good at school, acquiring the material resources you sometimes need to get yourself out of trouble, having cultural supports, a sense of cultural stability, a stable set of answers, whether it be from a religion or a philosophy or whatever, things, anchors that hold you in place when you're tested beyond your capacity. And what we are seeing is a disintegration of society that causes me to argue that the problem in West Central Scotland is that Glasgow got austerity 40 years before anyone else did. And this is the long-term consequence of it. And we can guarantee that what will happen in Greece and parts of southern Europe will follow a similar path if we don't change things. People like Richard Wilkinson and so on often say that poverty and inequality causes health inequalities and so on. I would argue that health inequalities very often cause poverty. There's a cycle here. And the cycle probably starts with chaotic early years. Those chaotic early years lead to mental health problems in young people. The mental health problems lead to behavioural problems, the inability to suppress inappropriate behaviour. I don't know what happens in England, but in Scotland they have this insane policy of excluding people from school if they have behaviour problems. Just when you need to include them more in society, we send them out into the big bad world. I was given a talk in a secondary school in Glasgow recently, and a teacher told me that they had a boy who was persistently crude. So what was the response to that? They excluded him from school. It's Christmas, you know. Got what you want. When you need to include people, our society tends to alienate. So the alienation leads to failure in education. They end up drinking cheap vodka behind the shopping centre. They get into a fight. They end up in jail. And we have a young offenders institution in Scotland, and I spend a lot of time there. Usually they let me out. And you talk to these 18-year-olds, what are you going to do when you leave? Nobody's going to give me a job. Okay, so what are you going to do? I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink. And what they never say, but what always happens is they have a couple of kids. And the kids suffer from the fact that fathers never experienced an attaching relationship with a parent, and he won't be able to extend that to his children. So these boys end up with no stable male role model, and the cycle continues. Loss of self-esteem, loss of sense of control, complete opposite of what Corey Keyes described as flourishing. And inevitability is drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence. And of course, if they survive that, premature diagnosis with heart disease, type 2 diabetes, etc. I haven't included any of this, but we've measured things like methylation of DNA, we've measured telomere length. The lower down the social scale you go, the shorter your telomeres are, the less methylation of DNA you find, and so on. The damage is lifelong, that starts in early life. So what we need to be thinking about if we want to cause wellness in our society is creating optimistic outlook, sense of control, sense of purpose and meaning, giving young people a confidence in their ability to deal with problems and providing support network. And one thing we can say completely for Scotland, but maybe for elsewhere, is that inequality is not due to what you think it's due to. It starts very early on in life. Early years experience is critically important if we're going to do anything about it. Conventional ways of preventing illness are not going to create wellness. So we decided to do something different. The way in which governments do things is like this. A minister decides he wants to fix health inequalities. So he gets a group of the great and the good into a committee room, and a civil servant listens and takes the minutes. And then 3 months later they come back and they read the minutes and they approve them and they talk a bit more, and 3 months later and 3 months later, and eventually they say, okay, this is what we want to do. They send a memo to the minister who approves it. A civil servant writes a strategic implementation plan which gets issued to the service, and nothing happens. And the reason nothing happens is that kind of policy development is all about imposing things on people who have not been involved in shaping what's getting imposed on them. So why should they be committed? You know, who's he to come and tell me how I should deal with the people I see every day? He's no idea what he's talking about, is the usual response. Okay, and I sympathise with that very strongly. So we decided to turn that in its head. We said, okay, let the system that deals with these problems design the solutions. And get them into a room to agree broadly what we want to do, and then let them go out and test what they say. And modify what they're doing in the light of what the results are. The classic way of doing things, give somebody money for 3 years to implement a project, and at the end of it, get a university to evaluate what's happened. And you can write the report, because the university will say, we can't find any evidence that anything has changed. Because actually what they tried to do away at the beginning didn't make any difference. But they didn't know it because some smart aleck was going to come 3 years down the line and measure it. What they do here is they measure what's happening every single day. This is the early years collaborative at work. 800 or 900 people came together. We started this 2 years ago. 800 to 900 people come together every 4 or 5 months and discuss what they've done and show charts that show what they've done and show what the impact is and share what's failed and what has succeeded. And gradually, what has succeeded begins to emerge. That's the permanent secretary. He looks really unstressed, doesn't he? He comes to all the meetings. Our finance minister did the usual ministerial thing. You know, he came to give a 20-minute speech. He stayed for 5 hours. He left proclaiming it the most exciting bit of public sector reform he'd ever seen. He couldn't believe it. The civil servants were going nuts because they had to cancel all these appointments. He asked me, after that, he said, look, if I find money to support an early years change fund, will it ultimately save money? And I didn't want to overhype the thing. I said, yeah, it will. But it might take 40 years. But by then you will be closing prisons. And his response was, that's exactly the right thing to do. This notion that politicians only have their eye on the next election, well, that may be your experience of politicians, but we have much better ones. So they all sit down and they say, okay. And they said, what do you want? At the end of the first, they said, we want Scotland to be the best place in the world to grow up. Okay, what does that mean? What are we going to measure? How much do we want things to change by when? And one of the things was about developmental abilities. And one of the things we said, we want 85% of all children to attain all their developmental milestones expected at 30-month assessment by the end of 2016. The process, the other things, the other 2 areas, we wanted 90% by age 5. And the other thing was we wanted to reduce stillbirth rate and infant mortality by 15% by the end of 2015. So you write down what are the drivers of change that you need to modify. And in each of these boxes there might be 20 or 30 things. Groups sitting in their own sort of county table will say, well, we could do this, we could try that. I've heard of somebody who, he said, right, we'll go away and measure it. So all these drivers are being modified literally on a day-to-day basis. This was the first run chart we saw from that very first meeting. It was tweeted. East Ayrshire Council tweeted the impact of Bedtime Bear on children's getting bedtime stories. One of the things that enhances children's developmental abilities is getting a bedtime story. So sheet of A4 paper, marker pen, week 1, 65% of kids in their nurseries will get bedtime stories. He handed out Bedtime Bear. Bedtime Bear, there's your Bedtime Bear, John. Bedtime Bear needs a story every night before he goes to sleep. So you, when he's going to sleep, you take him to Mummy and Daddy and get him to read Bedtime Bear a story. So the child gets the story. They got a result. It went up. The end of the first week. That was the first kind of thing we saw. every single nursery in Scotland began to do the same thing. And they published run charts. They asked all their kids every day. The only chief medical officer in the world who knew how many kids got a bedtime story. And they would learn, they would chart things. They would say there was a problem there because all the parents were out in the garden or something like that. So we had a garden party the next weekend, and we told them this, and we handed out books and so on. And gradually everything went up towards targets. This is Nina. This is my granddaughter. That's bedtime bear, okay? But I just showed that because Nina's so cute. But I can't avoid showing you. They all got these bears, and they all got stories. Lots of little things consistently at scale and do it well, and take the data that shows you're doing it. Lots of small gains produce enormous gains. That's why we won all those gold medals. They paid attention to the way the stitching could, change the airflow over the skin suits that they wore. They paid attention to the shape of the pedals and so on. Lots of small changes produce big changes. We now have the results of Stillbirth Rate, and we've achieved at the start of 2015 a 15% reduction. So we've decided to go on and try and achieve a 25% reduction in stillbirth rate. We think we've achieved a 15% reduction in infant mortality. And, there's still a bit of variation in the data, so we will leave that and not claim that as a hit yet. But, that is pretty astonishing in the space of 2 years to do that kind of thing. The interesting thing about the data coming from the 30-month assessment test is that 35% of the children don't actually turn up to the 30-month assessment. And I bet you that most of those 30% are kids that we need to be very interested in. And we've started a project beginning to look at, are there markers that allow us to identify children that we really need to be much more hands-on about, much early on. But when they said 85%, I asked the obvious question, what is it now? They said, we're not sure. Well, actually, we know that a hell of a lot of them aren't in the statistics. So we wouldn't have known that unless we'd measured it. And that's where it all starts. I just want to finish with a couple of quotes that underline our philosophy in all of this. Some of you may have heard of this guy, Jimmy Reid, communist trade union leader in the late 60s, early 70s. 1970, the Heath government wanted to shut down shipbuilding in Clyde, and Jimmy Reid stopped them, and he didn't stop them the usual way. He stopped them by taking them out to strike. He stopped them by taking the workers in and making them carry on building ships. They locked the doors and they built ships, and they did it so well that Heath's government stepped back and said, "Keep carrying on building ships." He's a tremendously charismatic orator, and Glasgow University is 564 years old, and like the other ancient Scottish universities, the university is headed by a Lord Rector who is elected by the student body. We're very democratic in Scotland, as you're about to find out. Jimmy Reid's rectorial address, I was a medical student in 1971. His rectorial address was reprinted in full in the New York Times, which described it as the single most important public speech since the Gettysburg Address. And those of us who heard that public speech thought that comparison with Abraham Lincoln was immensely flattering to Abraham Lincoln. His speech was about alienation, which he defined as the cry of men who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control. The frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision-making. The feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification have no real say in shaping their family and their destinies. He nailed it. He saw what was happening with the disintegration of society at that time, and he diagnosed that problem. And all the stuff that we've done since then has been to put the biological consequences of that together. The biological consequences are extreme. They're extreme for kids, they're extreme for young adults, they're extreme for people growing into older age. it affects the whole life course. And if we're going to create wellness in the world, we need to pay much more attention to investing in families and children, and creating the basis for that sense of control and positivity that happens more commonly in more affluent environments. The other guy I want to quote is this chap. He was a priest who 20 odd years ago was sent to a parish in South Los Angeles, and the local police predicted that the Latino gangs there would kill him within a week. You can see that 20 odd years later he's doing quite well. Lots of Latino gang friends. You got this guy, he went out and he spoke to them, and he learned their names and he interacted with them. And he realized the problem was lack of employment. He got this guy who was a film producer to buy him a disused bakery, and he started a company called Homeboy Bakeries. His second company had to be started shortly after, and that was Homeboy Tattoo Removal, because he realized the gang tattoos were causing real trouble. So he got a plastic surgeon friend of his to give them a laser, and they taught some of the gang members how to laser off their tattoos. So 20 odd years on, he comes over to Glasgow at the invitation of people trying to work with some of the violence and so on in the city. And I had the opportunity to take him to a school at lunchtime, and one thing he said there really struck me. And you know, for people in an altruistic profession, I keep telling the medical students about this, and the nursing students that I talk to. This has to be the guiding light of everything we do. What he said was, what we need is a compassion that stands in awe at the burdens the poor have to carry, rather than one that stands in judgment at how they carry them. We are far too judgmental, whether it be around asylum seekers or immigrants or people on benefits or whatever. How would we act if we were in their position? We need compassion as the fundamental driver in all of this. And while we've got the epigenetic, we've mapped the epigenetics, we've mapped the brain changes and so on, the solution is not medical, the solution is social and political, because it's political decisions that lead to the social and economic circumstances that cause these problems. Compassion seems to me to be a fundamental building block of every single religion that exists in human society. Every single religion, going back to Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But the one quote that I like most comes from Confucianism. A 9th century Chinese emperor produced this. Rather than punish the country's deviants, instead consider the poverty of the multitudes and relieve their misery. Then criminals will disappear. The reason why ordinary people act badly comes from their widespread inability to survive day to day. The reason why ignorant underclasses are not honest is because their rulers, who should be honest, are not. And you go from that and you see headlines like this. Austerity. The economists that I work with point out to me that this great hole in the public finances is entirely taken up by the amount of money that's gone to the banks. The public sector deficit that we have wouldn't be there if it all hadn't gone to the banks. And these people are still manipulating things in order to walk away with millions of pounds of money that should be helping out people. So Iceland, as far as I can tell, is the only one that's jailed bankers, and I guess that's not going to happen here anytime soon. But we really need to be alert to the way in which people are being damaged by policies that don't really seem to have much care for people. So our philosophy in Scotland is to get out there and do things. Okay? Be brave. Be brave enough to fail, but be honest enough to tell people about your failures. And when you have successes, spread the successes. Recruit followers. Tell people. And gradually, the whole of society will change. And as well as being brave, don't forget the hugs. Thanks very much. Questions? Yeah.
Some of those changes that we saw in the amygdala and other places in the brain, are those reversible?
Yes. When I first started doing this 5, 6, 7 years ago, we didn't know. It was all pretty new stuff. But we now know that even the epigenetic change, epigenetic change is just environmental modification of the genome. Change the environment, you change the epigenetic regulation. So there's now lots of evidence that this can change. Bruce McEwen was with me in Glasgow yesterday. We were talking about the latest phase and what we're doing about this. And Bruce is now convinced physical activity has hugely positive effect on hippocampal functioning. The other thing is mindfulness, meditation. Very powerful in changing a number of these things. And he knows the Dalai Lama, Bruce. And when you measure hippocampal volume in Buddhists, it's huge. The other group of people who have hypertrophic hippocampal volumes are London taxi drivers. Because big feats of memory enhance hippocampal volume. They capture new cells that appear in the hippocampus and they put them to work. And if you do the knowledge, someone measured hippocampal volume before and after they did the knowledge. It gets bigger. So Bruce suggests things like continuing to keep memory going, continuing to keep the blood flowing by taking physical activity, to meditate, as ways of changing all of this. The really interesting thing that we're doing in this Young Offenders Institution is we've got a mindfulness study going. And one of the things, the ventromedial nucleus of the prefrontal cortex is critical in suppressing inappropriate behavior. And there is lots of evidence that the balance between amygdala overactivity and ventromedial nucleus underactivity is probably a feature of offending. And I'm trying to get the justice people to support a study of visualizing this and then doing mindfulness to see if we can reverse some of these changes. Because sending these kids to prison ain't going to do them any good.
As a paediatrician, of course, I would absolutely support a tremendous amount of what you said, and it was fantastic. Is the situation exacerbated even more in the presence of migration and refugees and other things? Glasgow's had its foot with them as well.
Yeah.
It's not politically motivated, but it's the exacerbation there with that separation index.
The way I visualize this is with Maslow's hierarchy. If safety, if security is absent, none of the other things are going to happen. And I think, the kids in the refugee camps in Syria and so on, one can only shudder at the stresses they are experiencing. And we would predict, will emerge from all of this deeply scarred. One of the things that Bruce and I were talking about, there's an American group coming together with federal support to look at how you reverse some of these things as in adulthood. And so we've been talking a bit about some studies that we might do, that the best thing to do is to stop it happening. And, I just find these overloaded boats and so on, the poor kids trapped in those, they're never going to recover adequately from that. So I think a lot of where we are just now, we're visiting inhumanity on the most defenseless people, and no good will come of it. These kids are going to become radicalized, they're going to, it's just awful.
I admire what you've done. Having tried to do research with grant work, government money, there is always a finite amount of money. Income generation and monetization of this process is probably an essential component. Do you have ideas how you commercially monetize the interventions you have research?
You mean earn money from it?
No.
Get
other people
Yeah.
share in the process, but from their own financial resources of whatever type.
Well, there are, people like Gates and so on is interested in these sort of areas. There are foundations that are interested in spirituality and these sort of things. But a lot of business is out there. I mean, I spent yesterday with the leader of the City Council in Glasgow, and we were planning to use the resources he has at his display, the human resource, in slightly different ways. And you speak to, you know, I'm actually doing more work for the Scottish Government now than I did when they paid me. You speak to the Health Minister who wants to change the way GPs work, and the GPs in the most deprived areas are saying, yeah, we want to work that way. So it's a lot of it's about using existing resource more effectively, and therefore the money you need to research this becomes much less because you don't, you know, the people are already out there. You maybe need study for, you know, to fund MRI time and all that kind of thing. But you just become innovative in the way you get these things funded.
Kindly given the vote of thanks already. So Harry, I can't think of a better speaker to give the Tony Memorial lecture of this nature. Absolutely thought-provoking, challenging to us, and the epitome of a medical person identifying a problem, thinking about it, and then following it through during your lifetime. I've heard Sir Harry speak on this topic on 2 previous occasions over the last 10 years. Each time he adds more and more evidence and detail to his presentations. Absolutely compelling information society should take note and change. There's only one thing I regret you didn't put across on your presentation today. I think, in fact, you may have mentioned it and I've missed it, but previous 2 presentations, the seed that started this thought process, correct me if I'm wrong, was a ward round in Glasgow, and a senior nurse on the ward round who were going to discharge a lady from following an operation because it was due 5 days after the operation, and she said, no, you can't do that. She's going to get a wound infection because she came from a certain street in Glasgow. The sister observed during her career that women and people from that part of Glasgow were far more predisposed to get wound infection and complications of surgery. And that, I think you introduced in the past as one of the seeds that started this progression. And it's a wonderful observation, just listening to some of these observations. I've had many follow-up conversations with colleagues in the past, where it's just sown a seed and you follow that through over the years. So Harry, fantastic lecture, and I'd like to, on behalf of the Society, award this when you